Welcome back to Play on Nerds, the only show that dares to pull the pin on the Holy Land grenade of Antioch and count to 4. I'm your host, Ron Rader, and with me is my patsy without coconut shells,
Mark Allen.
And this is my trusty servant, Patsy. We have ridden the length and breadth of the land in search of knights who will join me in my court at Camelot. I must speak with your lord and master.
What, ridden on a horse?
Yes.
You're using coconuts.
What?
You've got 2 empty halves of coconut and you're banging them together.
So? We have ridden since the snows of winter covered this land. Through the kingdom of Mercia, through...
Where'd you get the coconuts?
We found them.
Great.
Greetings, gentle listen folk.
So, Mark, you want to tell everyone what we are serving up on the buffet of geek today?
Correction, all you can geek buffet. So today we're going to discuss character creation for Dungeons & Dragons 5e, various tips and tricks and different methods, character concepts in general, past characters we enjoyed playing as well. Then we'll be moving on to the comic corner and discussing characters in comic books, character development, that sort of thing. And then we'll wrap it up with our video beat and geekiness in pop culture and movies and TV and such.
Well, great. Let's get rolling. First, we're going to start with a little bit about D&D, Dungeons & Dragons, character creations. So, Mark, questioning you, what's your favorite character class or race to play, or perhaps that you've played in the past? Give me some insight there.
Oh, man, my favorite race, I'll start with my favorite race, because, it's the one I always come back to, maybe because I have a beard and I'm short, but I love the dwarfs. I don't know, just their lore, and just, I love dwarfs, like, I always have. I mean, you can't beat beard, beer, and armor, right?
That's right. And if I can just insert real quick, in our campaign that we've been playing the last 2.5 years, your first character was a dwarf, and I'd have to say that your role playing of the dwarf was very iconic, and not only was it an awesome portrayal of a dwarf, but your ability to role play it really got everybody else into role playing. And yeah, I felt like Gimli from the Jackson movies was sitting right there next to me. Very well done.
Well, thank you, sir. So yeah, I would say dwarfs were a race. Now, as far as class goes, man, I have really struggled finding, I have yet to find a class I really don't like. Just from what I've played for 5th edition and 3.5, and 4. I like both range and combat. So even something that does both of those fairly well is okay. But I have not yet played a bard, so maybe I would not like a bard. I don't know. But I know there's various combos if you're playing a bard, the best one to do is a gnome, or but honestly, I've not really delved into that, so to speak. No pun intended. Maybe there was a pun intended, actually.
There probably was.
But, I don't know. I really always lean back towards, either magic user of some sort, wizard, warlock. Rangers are good because they have the shooting. Or fighter. I guess fighter is probably one of my favorites currently because they introduced the gunslinger rules. Which is, that can be a little bit controversial. Oh, you can't have guns in my castles, but I like what we've been doing for homebrew is I have a fighter character, and he fires once, every other round?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I don't have it memorized.
I mean, the official rules are it takes an action to reload.
Yeah, okay.
And then if you misfire, it takes another action to repair, and it's really cool because it has a great balance. And as much as gunfighters in D&D go, when they hit, they're very powerful, but the chances for misfire are kind of high. So we've been homebrewing the rules a little bit, just to slow down the rate of fire. And, it's such a rare thing in the world you've created. So I would say fighter is probably up there for my favorite class so far. I know in the past I had a monk. This is kind of a funny story for 3rd edition. And I did not do much. We were playing a silly campaign. I'll digress a little bit and say, when I say silly, the whole point of the campaign was what bound us together as a party. We were all hunting a Tarrasque, or Tarrasque, some people call it. And, it killed our family or something, just something silly. There's no way we're ever going to find this thing, and my monk character, he had a bow staff, and he had a pink stuffed teddy bear. and he would throw the teddy bear up in the air and say, "Furry friend of destruction," and everybody would look up, and he'd hit him in the gut with a bow staff. So
Hilarious.
So yeah, I put an enchantment on it that allowed for distraction and stuff, and like I'd get an advantage on the attacks basically. But it's kind of fun, just furry friend of destruction, and everybody's thinking, oh, it's gonna do something big, and it was just a regular old teddy bear you throw up, and everybody goes, huh? And then you attack. So
it sounds like a lot of humor in that campaign.
Oh yeah. Matter of fact, almost every encounter, like right after the encounter, we'd fight goblins or kobolds or whatever. We'd ask the DM, "Do we see the Trask?" And he was like, "Funny thing, you just missed it. Like you found like a small part of a toenail."
Of course you did.
Yeah, and it was like, "Darn it, so slippery."
Of course you did.
So yeah, it was great. We never did find it, but it was a really tongue-in-cheek beer and pretzels type campaign. But that was probably one of my favorites. What about yours?
For me, I would say in the past when I first started D&D, I was more into characters that were modeled off of Conan. So I started on Moldvay, the basic set put together by Moldvay. And in that basic set, there were no distinction between race and classes, which is not something I particularly like. So if you were a dwarf, you didn't pick a dwarf fighter. You didn't pick a dwarf magic user. You were a dwarf. If you were an elf, they were sort of like magic user fighters mixed. But if you were a fighter, you were a human. If you were a magic user, you were a human. And if you were a thief, you were a human. It didn't take me too long after that, though, that I kind of altered the rules because I had seen AD&D, which had the class race distinction. And what I would do is I'd use fighter very often over the other classes, in part because in those early days, magic users, thieves, now called rogues, they had such low hit dice. Even clerics, which I would play a cleric because I thought it was interesting, they had magic, even their hit dice were lower than fighters. And so I would typically stick to a fighter or a cleric for the longest time. But I was really influenced by 80s fantasy, 60s and 70s fantasy novels. So, the Conan archetype, I always wanted to be him. And then when I got into AD&D and there was an opportunity to play Barbarian, I would add that as a class. Anything that seemed tough, I'm sure what it was is I was this nerdy small boy who was fulfilling fantasies by playing these characters who were bold and tough and masculine. But over time, I guess I should say, as the first edition have developed, I still stuck to those martial characters. So, like when Unearthed Arcana came out, which was really a collection of classes and ideas introduced through Dragon Magazine, some of the classes or subclasses, however you want to refer to them, were like Paladin, Cavalier, and I'd give those classes a shot. And as I said before, Barbarian, sticking to those martial classes. But I too never, I wanted to do a bard, but I didn't know, am I going to sing? What am I going to do to make this into a bard? And I never really had the guts to role play that. And monk, I don't know, monk, the original monks, not the monks like in 5e, they just seemed too weak or esoteric for me. Excuse me. And so I really stuck to the martial class. Now that I've got many more years down the road into role-playing, I like to stretch my muscles and play other types of characters. In a campaign I'm playing right now, I'm playing a character that is multi-classed. So one of the classes is Blood Hunter. So yeah, that's sort of a little bit falls into the martial class. But also he is a warlock. So it's forcing me out of my comfort zone to think about spells and how to use spells and how to do that sort of thing during combat. But when it comes to character creation in general, I focus on narrative. I've always been a narrative over numbers guy, even before I knew what that term meant, which is basically this. I'm in my D&D games, I am more interested in the overall story rather than do I have the ultimate character who is, at his peak in terms of combat. Do I have all the best stats? Did I pick the right skills? Did I get just the right weapon? Have I found enough magic items yet? Is there enough gold in my coffer? That kind of stuff I enjoy, don't get me wrong, but I'm much more interested in seeing the journey that my character is on, what kind of changes he goes through, and just seeing this shared novel, if you will, with other players unfold. I enjoy that narrative aspect. So for me, I really feel like while I might be challenged by certain classes or certain races, I still enjoy the story more than the actual mechanics of the game. So I'm at a point where I'm really willing to try any type of character or class. I just realized I didn't mention race. I typically stick to the traditional D&D races. So I'm going to play a human, an elf, a half elf, a dwarf. Recently just started trying some of the classes that are newer. They're not new, but just newer, like tiefling or dragonborn. I don't find those as easy to role play, but I like the challenge of learning something new. So I'm trying to expand on this. Let's stick to the Conan archetype.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. We all grow and learn, and as we play. But I mean, it's funny you mentioned you like narrative over the game, because I was thinking the same thing. I was honestly thinking, well, that's the whole game, is getting characters together and seeing how they grow and how they learn, and what develops just from narrative standpoint. The game is fun. Don't get me wrong. I like the encounters, and that's honestly one of my favorite things. But like just some of the role playing aspects and some of the stuff we've had in your campaign has been amazing.
We have good role players.
Yes, we do. But I mean, that's the whole point. Even non-player characters, play a big part into it sometimes.
Sure.
So that's kind of neat that you mentioned narrative over, I guess, function.
Narrative over numbers.
Yes, narrative over numbers. That's what you're saying.
And it's interesting, if I can just throw this in real quick. I was watching another fella on YouTube, and unfortunately I cannot remember the name of his channel. But he's a guy in our age range, probably a little closer to my age than yours. And basically, one of the things he pointed out was he unboxed a Moldway Basic set. He hadn't had one in years, and he started talking about it. And as his mind started to get refreshed, he pointed out how the Moldway set was real. This basic Dungeons and Dragons was really set up to be narrative over numbers, and 5e has a lot of things in common, at least in terms of the approach to Moldvay. The more simplification. 5e is much more simple than 3.5, even though it's a wonderful game. And I really believe, and this guy espoused, that it is in part to make the narrative aspect really just come alive in your game. It's easier to role. Basically, it's easier to role play when there's less number crunching going on.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's, that's one of the reasons I have not decided to try like Shadowrun. I mean, the concept is great. Don't get me wrong, the storyline and everything, but I've heard how crunchy it can be, and I'm like, I don't know. I would rather just play a game, and focus on role playing and that sort of aspect. Now, feel free to comment if you don't, if you don't agree, but like for me, if I get bogged down with the system, then it's harder for me to get into the character.
I would pose this question to you, just to really confirm what you're saying. Think about our group, our campaign that I run, and imagine in the beginning, the first 6 months to the year of that game, and we have a large group of 9 people, and half the people had never played any role-playing game before. Could you imagine them trying to do all that number crunching? Certainly they could do it, but I kind of believe that their interest in the game and doing it would have waned if they would have spent most of their time doing mathematics or
absolutely,
or just trying to find out what is the rule, what do I got to add, what do you do this time. I think their interest would have waned.
Oh, absolutely. I did play with a smaller group, the hero system, which, don't get me wrong, it's very crunchy. It's a good system, and it's very generic, so to speak, because you're playing heroes, and whether it's a fantasy setting, Old West, whatever. But it only used D6. We talked about this last episode. Games that only use D6. And there was some sort of function. I never did learn it, but if you roll this certain number, if you roll 5s and 6s, that's 2 points of body and this. And I'm like, okay, which causes an extra wound. And it got so bogged down. And on your attack, I'm playing just a dwarf barbarian basically, and they're like, okay, roll your attack. Okay, what do I roll? You roll 16d6. And I'm like, you're kidding. And then you count up all the 5s and 6s, and then you call it. I'm like, this is Warhammer basically at this point. But I never did understand the body system or, how the wounds worked or anything. I'm like, oh, okay then. That's weird. But I couldn't get into role playing as easily because of that. Just because I'm rolling so many. Like, just let me roll a d20 and see if I hit or not.
For sure. It's interesting you say that. You just gave me an idea that I thought, and I will just digress for a second here.
Oh, absolutely.
And then
Go
we
ahead.
can move on and talk about how we create our characters. But sometime in the future, we should talk about the difference between running a tabletop role-playing game with a large group as compared to a small group. And the reason why that triggered this was you had just mentioned this mechanic about, okay, where do you wound the other character if you hit and whatnot. I sort of like rolling an extra die to see where a character hit the enemy. And I even have a list for that I was going to incorporate in our campaign, but it's such a large group that sometimes combat can take forever. And if I were to add that element, which I think would be fun with a smaller group, it would have just bogged us down further. So anyway, I digress. Let's put that in the old treasure chest for later.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, we'll put that in the hoard because actually, it's funny you mentioned that because to continue on your digression a little bit.
Okay.
The Wild West game that I designed, tabletop mini game that I designed,
yes.
the wounds basically work like that, where you draw a card from a 52 deck to see how badly they're hurt, and then you'll see where they're hit. And like depending on where they're hit, you could draw another time on the wound chart. And like if you're gut shot, it's going to be more painful than in the arm.
For sure. Right?
So yeah, it's funny you mentioned that because it's like, yeah, I incorporated that in some of the games I've designed, and I've always liked that element. Matter of fact, speaking of Warhammer not too long ago, they came out with a system that was kind of a half role-playing game, half mini game, system called Mordheim.
I remember it,
late
but
90s.
I never played.
Yeah, and it was really cool because it was a basic, small skirmish battle game, tabletop battle game that you'd advance your characters. After each game, you'd see if you found stuff, what treasure you found, what armor, and it's like, oh, I can finally afford to buy the better sword and that sort of thing. But if they were injured during the game, you rolled on a D66 chart to see how badly they were injured. And I knew guys who were into it so much, like you could lose a leg in battle, and that was one of the results on the D66. And the guy says, let me see your clippers real quick. And he actually clipped the leg off his miniature right there. And the next week he came back and it was all modeled with like a peg leg and a bandage. And I'm like, that's really cool.
Oh, wow.
But he was into it that much, and I'm just like, I would just, say, yeah, he's got a peg leg or something.
I know. Save that miniature for another day.
Right. It like subtracted 2 to movement or something. I don't know the in-game effect off the top of my head, but it was kind of neat because sometimes you get boosts as well. Like you may have gotten slashed in the face and look ugly now, but that would cause fear to other opponents or something.
Intimidation. Hey,
Intimidation, exactly. So it's kind of neat. But moving on, now that we've digressed enough.
Now that we've digressed enough, how do you go about creating your characters for Dungeons and Dragons specifically?
I'll be quite honest. I cheat.
Okay.
Different tropes from TV, movies, other games, I use quite a bit and get an idea and go, oh man, it'd be really cool to do like a mage gunner from Warhammer or War Machine rather. Mm-hmm. And I think I've mentioned that to you off the air about the different mage gunners and such, how they're basically wizards that are gunslingers as well. And it's kind of neat to do it that way because then you get the idea and then it develops from there. Like for my characters, I don't go to min-maxing or anything like that. I just, okay, I'll roll up a character and dump the higher end stats into what it's going to be. Like, I'm sorry, if I'm doing a warlock, I'm going to dump charisma a lot. Like, oh yeah, I got to put, so maybe it's min-maxing. I don't know. I don't purposely do that. I'm just like, oh, see what I can do here. But it really develops over time. And honestly, I have to play a few games before I can really delve into that character.
That makes sense. Let me ask you this question. Do you roll stats before you determine whether or not you're going to play a specific race or a class? Or do you know the race or class that you want to play already and then go out and roll and adjust accordingly?
I adjust accordingly. The second one. Because D&D Beyond has made it so easy to create characters now. And like to me, I've thought about honestly just pulling the trigger and doing the subscription just so I can have more than 6 characters. So to me, it's just fun to sit, you know what? I'm just going to create another character just for fun. I don't have any intentions on using it ever, but it's a lot of fun, and so I'll pick the race and the class, and then I roll the stats, and then put the stats accordingly, and then I equip accordingly, so from there, it's just a simple matter of what this character would look like if I were to play them.
Certainly. I totally get that. I'll often have an archetype in my head, as I mentioned earlier, wanting to play Conan as a kid first into D&D. And I guess I'm often influenced by, obviously, the pop culture around me. And I'll have archetypes in my head, and I'll approach it that way. I traditionally did. Now I think, getting back to that whole narrative over numbers, I try to think of a character and what their background might be and what they're going through, and where could that lead, and what kind of journey could that character go on. So recently I'm a player in a campaign, and I am playing in Call of the Netherdeep. It's a Matt Mercer
Yes,
or a Critical Role campaign.
Yeah.
And I'm playing a character, and I really like Vikings. So I thought, how do I tie this into this campaign? And so I started to look up, and Vasselheim is sort of a Nordic kind of area. And so I built this Viking character. And I was looking at Viking tropes a little bit, trying to break away from it. My character's not just a human. He's half elf, and I'm thinking about his background. I'm thinking about, okay, so his dad was an elf who sold potions from Vasselheim, and then he took throughout the continents, Taldore, Alexandria, and he's selling these potions. And so he's a traveling salesman, and for some reason he didn't stick around in this small fishing village and raise this boy that I had with this human. And so what does that mean for that boy to have an absent father? And I came up with all this stuff for the character, and now he's on this journey, and he wants to find his father, and that's why he left his home, but he gets caught up in the storyline of Call of the Netherdeep. So I'm thinking about all of this stuff, right?
Right.
And then about 5 or 6 sessions into the game, and I'm playing the character just thinking about what I think he would be like. One of the other player characters said to me, "Oh, wow, I really like how you are channeling this inner Jason Momoa Aquaman thing for your character." And that never crossed my mind once.
Aquaman, Aquaman, no one greater than Aquaman, king of Atlantis, king of the sea. Where the danger is, that's where he'll be, always defending you.
But it must be in there. I never attempted to copy it. I only saw Aquaman once when it first came out. Right. But for somehow I'm cheating, as you mentioned a second ago, and I am somehow channeling my inner Jason Momoa Aquaman, according to this player. And I have to admit, I think she was probably right.
Well, and that's just it, right? Jason Momoa, I don't know. My wife she has a big crush on him, I think.
Well, if you think about it, I guess I haven't got too far away from my standards of wanting to play. And Momoa played Conan.
Yeah, so
my Conan Marshall characters. But here's a question for you. So when you're rolling up your stats in D&D, what approach do you do? Do you do the 3 dice? Do you roll over a 1? Do you roll 4 6-sided dice and kick out the lowest? What do you do?
I can't honestly remember what D&D Beyond does. I remember we used to kick out the lowest. We'd roll and then kick out the lowest. And I believe that's what D&D Beyond does. But they have 5 dice and kick out the lowest.
I don't recall D&D Beyond
6,
either.
But I mean, I know it rolls right there in the app for me. And
sure.
then I see the total. I'm like, oh, there. I look at anything over like 10 as good, like 10 and above as good. And I'm like, oh yes, But if I roll like a 6 on one of them, I'm like, I am not taking that 6. I will not, because it's not a very heroic character. If they have one stat, it's like, yeah, you're great in everything else, but boy, you are not social at all, and you are very ugly, and
But that
charisma.
Sometimes those really strange low rolls put into a certain attribute could lead to a whole different type of role playing for the character.
Absolutely.
If your charisma is that bad,
right?
Or if you are super weak, like if in the current campaign of Critical Role, the character Laudna has a super low strength. I don't know if she plays that out at all, but I'm trying to think. There was another character in one of the campaigns that had a super low trait. Maybe Grog's intelligence or something.
Oh yeah, Grog's
You know?
intelligence. I mean, he was
Yeah.
he was like,
I did something smart.
you know, like,
So there's just something really cool about
What did I say?
you know?
sticking to that attribute and playing it. I really like that. Well, my approach is this: I roll the 4 6-sided die, and I kick out the lowest. I roll all 6 attributes first, or 6 times, and I write those 6 results down, and then I pop them into the attributes I want them to go in. So if I have a list and 18's my highest, because somehow I got 3 6s, and I know I want my character to be a fighter, I'm going to put that 18 in strength.
Right.
If
Or
it's gonna
Dex.
be, yeah, and if it's going to be a rogue, I'm going to put that in Dex.
Right.
You know, so
For sure.
that's how I approach it.
Yeah, that's pretty much how I do it as well. But when you talk about the nitty gritty, like there's so many combos you can do between equipment, race, class, and the stats help definitely. I mean, that's your basic line for your character. You know, that's your basic starting point, I guess, is the stats. But it's just like, man, there's so much you can do regarding different types of character. Like, let's take your barbarian, for example. You know, it was always a Conan type archetype, you know, like you had mentioned that. But now you can do like a ton of different barbarians even.
Certainly, yeah.
Not just between race and like the barbarian class, but also because you could do like the Stormwrath barbarian or like all these different types. And I think they're not in Tasha's, they're in Xanathar's, I believe,
I think so.
where it talks about the different types of barbarians, and I'm like, oh, this is kind of neat. This fits more. It delves a little bit deeper into the barbarian culture, if you will, or you know what makes a barbarian, and I think that's kind of neat. And I like that for any number of the classes. And you mentioned you're playing a blood hunter now, and I'm playing a blood hunter in your campaign, but I'm playing it completely different.
Yeah.
Because you know he's a Dhampir or vampire. And I pictured Vampire Hunter D when I created him.
That's great.
And he's kind of developed more into Dracula. But
That's very cool as well.
it's funny because it's like I totally forget being a blood hunter. I'm like, oh yeah, I've got spells.
Yeah. There's things I can do. Different
There's kinda
curses.
neat, and that's the trick with the blood hunter, I believe, is I just started playing it this way recently, where you do a curse and then you rush in and fight. You know, you weaken them with some spells first, and then you go in. And I'm like, oh, okay, that makes a little bit more sense.
Yep, I had to remind myself of that as well. A second ago you mentioned D&D Beyond making it so easy to make characters. And I think there's something that should be pointed out. A lot of folks enjoy playing D&D. It's just fantastic. They enjoy it. But there's a second part of the hobby they enjoy, and that is just making characters.
Oh, absolutely. That's why I said I like doing it, you know, just sitting there and like while we're watching TV, sometimes I'll just, you know, roll up a character on D&D Beyond just for fun and develops from there.
For sure. When I was a kid and I first got D&D, so I could play D&D on the weekend on occasion, but I was never the DM at first. And so I would spend, the rest of the week just making characters. Of course on notebook paper, but constantly making characters and coming up with ideas. It really got the juices flowing. I remember this campaign that I'm running that you're in, when we had our session 0 where people were creating characters. As I mentioned earlier, half the people were brand new to D&D, didn't know what they were doing. So we all got together, and those of us who had experienced helped the others make their characters while we were making our own. And it seemed like everybody had a blast.
Oh, yeah. Session 0, I'm a big proponent for Session 0 games. I plan on doing one for my family when we kick off our campaign.
Yeah, that's the way to do it.
Absolutely. It gives them a taste of the rules and taste of, let's make characters, and then, we'll do a small adventure and then go from there. But
I'm actually thinking about doing something for the first time since I started playing D&D. I've learned a lot from the campaign I'm playing in now and the campaign that I'm running now. And so when I do the next campaign for our group, what I'm hoping to do is to give everyone a guide that I type out about the world and about what some of the specific character options are for the world we'll be playing in. So I'm hoping that makes it easier for folks to create characters, but also lends an element of fun.
Oh, absolutely. And it does. The more you go into those nooks and crannies and details, the better it can be. Like, and you don't have any players surprising you with like, oh, by the way, I'm a gunslinger or anything like that.
Yes, I'm a blood hunter, gunslinger. No, just
Right.
another question for you. Let's
Yeah.
keep this ball rolling. A second ago, or a few minutes ago, you had mentioned min-maxing in passing. Can you mind taking a couple seconds and describing what min-maxing is and what your thoughts are?
Certainly. It's funny because you mentioned that, and like I said, I've never really done it. I know players who have, and one of our players, our rogue, our Tabaxi rogue, he wasn't able to make it one night, and I played his character for him. And his mother-in-law even said, "Oh, he min-max was the best of them. Like he knows how to min-max." And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm getting that." Like he was very very good at being a rogue, like and a thief, like.
And when you say very good, what did he do that made it min-maxing? I'm going to look
Like
up
his
the
sleight of
definition.
hand. I was gonna say yes. His sleight of hand was like phenomenal. You get like +6 as sleight of hand or something. Like I guess I did do a little bit of min-maxing on a character I just created not too long ago. He's a sniper. He's a fighter. Gunslinger fighter because I'm into the gunslinger right now. But he had a bad news from Critical Role, and I'm treating it like a sniper rifle, right? Mm-hmm. And he's a halfling. So imagine a halfling sniper, boom, like getting blown back. But I maxed out his, so he'd be stealthy. He gets a +10 to stealth. That would be like a min-max. And I took the minimum attributes of, something else. And I'm thinking that was good because we just lost power for briefly. Like it was like a split second. The power went off here in the studio, but
Wow,
I'm
that's
so
a
glad
sign.
that my computer has a battery and the interface runs off the computer. So we did not lose anything on your end for the listeners. But it did freak us out when the lights just go off. We're like, oh no. It was really odd. But I digress. So yeah, my sniper rifle guy, I guess I min-maxed him a little bit. I did play with a guy back in 4th, maybe 3.5, and he played a paladin, and I've played this guy with various games, and he's always been this way, where I'm going to exploit the rules to the best benefit that I can get.
Well, sure.
And right, and he was like, we called him Loophole Chris, because it was like, oh, it doesn't say I can't take 40 tanks in my army, so I'm going to. It was like, what? Like that's really cheesy and underhanded, and it's just like there was a game I played him. I kid you not, Ron. Like a standard Warhammer 40,000 game should last about an hour and a half to 3 hours. This game was over in 15 minutes.
Oh, wow.
He rolled up with a transport, and I'm like, okay, well, I'm ready. I'm playing orcs. We're really combat oriented. I'm just gonna, punch him in the face. Whatever pops out of that transport, I'm ready for. He popped out of there, and back at the time, this is 3rd edition, maybe 4th. He popped out of there with a ton of flamer templates, and just toasted my orcs, and my whole command squad was gone. And you take out the command structure of an orc army, they're gone. They run. Back then, anyway. And it was like, oh, okay, well, that happened. Like. I was ready, but apparently not, because he just toasted me. I mean, just rolled right, and he was laughing about it. I'm like, that was really chintzy, dude. Like, I'd feel bad as a player if I did that to another player.
Oh, for sure.
But he built his D&D character similar, like his paladin. He was like, I'm just gonna be really, really, really good at healing and close combat, and I'll just heal myself and be really good at close combat. And he was.
Yeah, well,
But,
there's a tendency to want to do that, right?
Yeah.
So if you're playing a character where certain attributes are the most important for that character's success, you're going to dump all of your skill points, all of your experience into those skills and ignore everything else. So you're maxing out one area and keeping everything else to a minimum. And I think perhaps we all have a tendency to do that because we think we're going to have the most success. Do you find that you intentionally do that? Or do you try to balance your characters out?
I try to balance them out a little bit. If you look at the vampire character I'm currently playing in your campaign, yeah, he has resistance to poison. Makes sense. He's undead, right?
Sure.
But he's very vulnerable to cold, believe it or not,
Right.
running water, and piercing damage.
Right.
And that's not really come up too much for him in your campaign. But like if you say take D6 piercing damage, I'm actually supposed to take more because he's vulnerable to it, if I'm not mistaken. So.
Oh yeah,
Like,
that's true. That's right.
Yeah. So when it does come up, and now that I've told you that,
Great. Now, good.
he's
Never remember
dead.
that.
But so yeah, I tried to balance them out, and that was actually a homebrew that I did. I was like, okay, Dompiers, they can, and sunlight, they don't like it, but they can be out in it. I'm like, no, he can't be in sunlight. Like I purposely balance him with some weaknesses that are traditional vampire weaknesses.
Sure.
Because he would be so good in combat, and I gave him the extra benefits, legendary actions, if you will, of shape-shifting, once per long rest, or twice per long rest. Once into a form, and then once out of the form.
Nice.
So he can become mist or bat, once per long rest, and back to his vampiric form. So, which has gotten me out of a couple scrapes with him, I've seen.
Yeah, as you play that character, he does not seem overpowered. I've had other players in campaigns who certainly are overpowered, and the player didn't intend to do this, but the players would destroy my encounter.
Oh.
And so that's a bummer. So I think that's where min-maxing sometimes can cause an issue in the game. But I've never seen that with your character. Before we move on from characters, here I have a question for you. What is the hardest D&D class to play, and why?
Oh wow, that's a good question. You really caught me off guard with that one.
Want me to give you what I think?
Yeah, go for it, and then I'll share.
Well,
my
one thing
thoughts.
we haven't talked about is alignment. I don't, as a DM, I have not been monitoring how my characters play their character alignment, how my players play their characters alignment. I don't monitor that too much because we have a group of a lot of new people. However, if you are playing into your alignment, it can be difficult if you are lawful good. And when I first started, that's what paladins were. When I first started playing paladins, they were lawful good. And that's how I kind of view paladins. I know there's some variations on that theme, but I just have always found if you're going to play any character that's lawful good, and oftentimes it can be a paladin or a cleric, it can really cause strife between you and the rest of your party and their intentions. I don't know if you know this. This character is no longer alive in the campaign that I'm running that you play in, but there was a lawful good character, and I did not force this person to stick to the lawful good alignment, although ultimately she started to stick to it right before her character perished. But for most of the game, because it was a new player, I did not say anything about her not actually playing a lawful good character as a lawful good character. So ultimately, my answer is Paladin's the class that's the most difficult for me, even though I really want to do it. I like the idea of I'm lawful good and I'm going out there, I've got this oath and I'm serving the world. But playing that lawful good alignment, it can really be difficult.
Oh, absolutely. And it's funny that you mentioned that because I was actually, before you started answering, I was like, I'm probably cleric is what I was thinking. Like to get into that headspace of, they don't come across, I mean, you can play them this way, but they don't come across as a holier than thou type attitude, but you could certainly play it that way.
Certainly.
And I, like in my mind, I always have to play it that way. If I'm a cleric, there's a reason they're a cleric. They work for the church. They're doing, and I mentioned to you a few weeks ago, I think, about how fun it would be to have an all evil character party and fight the quote unquote bad guys that are actually good guys and like flip it, a mirror universe type thing. And that just gave me an idea for, that'd be fun to do like a really evil cleric at some point,
Right.
Oh, no, I'm not casting cure wounds. I'm casting cause wounds, like it'd be fun.
You know who we should talk to about that?
Oh, yeah.
We have a mutual friend,
Yeah.
Moose, who
yeah.
was in a campaign, and I think he was a co-DM of it. That was all evil characters. Have to find out how that went. I have seen and seen on YouTube and read articles for many DMs who have ran so-called evil campaigns, and they don't last very long.
No, well, and that's the fun. Like, kind of like a tongue-in-cheek, fun, silly campaign.
Sure.
That's how I view it. Like, like just a one-off type thing. Like, 3 adventures, done. Call it good. Because I think people would get tired of playing somebody so evil.
For certain.
So, I mean, we try to take a break from the evils of the world by playing D&D, and play evil in D&D. It's like, it can be fun. Don't get me wrong. But, and you hear of actors saying, oh, I had a lot of fun being this evil character, but it drains you.
Sure.
It wears on you after a time. Like, Bill Skarsgård played Pennywise, and he said he had to have therapy afterwards because he was just like, I'm traumatizing these poor kids who are actors, like, and they're like, yeah, you're freaky, like you're scary, so he felt bad about it. And I mean, he's a good guy, but
That's
I
hilarious.
digress.
That's hilarious.
So moving on to characters and comic books.
Sure,
and,
yeah.
We'll move on to our comic corner now. I love some of the golden age of comics. I'll just kick it off by saying I love early comics, but my true love, we've talked about it, it's been no secret, 80s and 90s comics and storylines are where it's at for me.
Yep.
But I look at Batman, in particular Batman and Robin from the 50s versus Batman from the 90s. Completely different, right?
Oh yeah,
and
for
that's
sure.
a lot of that had to do with the history of comics, which we will get into in a future episode and talk about the comics code and all that stuff. But it's weird to see how characters have developed over the years. The headliners are really easy to talk about that way. Oh, Batman, he's really become dark and gritty. Well, the funny thing is, when he was created, he was supposed to be dark and gritty. It was like a film noir, guy dressed up as a bat fighting crime. And then through the 50s, he was kind of campy. In the 60s, the television show certainly leaned in that and did not help, the dark aspect. And then 89 hit, and we see Tim Burton's Batman, and that really flipped the script. And he was inspired by Frank Miller. So it's like, oh, a Batman can be dark again? This is great. And that's where I really fell in love with the Batman, and the whole character of Batman.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because Miller certainly brought back a very gritty Batman, but Batman left the campiness in the late 60s, early 70s, right after the show, actually, with the Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil run on Detective Comics. And they dropped dropped Robin.
Yes, yeah.
So it was either Batman or Detective. I can't remember which title off the top of my head. And they were certainly influenced by the horror comics at the time. Mm-hmm. And Neil Adams had a much more realistic art style. And so when I got into comics, that's what I was seeing as Batman. And when I finally got my hands on some of these comics you were talking about a second ago, 50s and 60s, I was not into them. Right. I didn't like the campy Batman at all.
And neither did I. And I only I like it now as an adult because of the campiness, because of the nostalgia factor, I guess. I didn't like it as a kid.
Now I like it.
Now I can appreciate it for what it was.
Certainly.
Looking through the lens of time, I guess, and then go, okay, I get it now. But you're right. Neil Adams and O'Neil, that's when I started collecting Batman as well. And I remember there was a storyline with the Scarlet Witch, and it was very adult. And I don't know if it means sexuality or anything, because it was a little bit of that. It may have been a detective. But
Scarlet Witch is Marvel.
You
might be thinking of a different character.
Red Witch or something. It may have been how DC and Marvel kept going back and forth.
Sure.
Deathstroke and Deadpool. Slade Wilson and
For sure.
So it may have been something like that. But I remember this particular issue. There was this woman in red, and she was scantily dressed or whatnot, and she wore a mask. And I was like, oh, that's weird. But she took her mask off, and I was blown away. I was like, whoa. That mask, as soon as she removed it, she looked like I don't know, like a zombie from Walking Dead or something. I was like, oh man, that's creepy.
This isn't ringing a bell. It should, but it's not ringing a bell.
Yeah, it was like just a 2-issue arc, I think, and I was just like, wow, this is really good. That's kind of one of my first forays into Batman. I was like, this is really and Two-Face at the time, it was like, wow, this is not. Like you said, very heavily influenced by some of the horror comics, for sure.
For sure. Speaking about comics and characterization in general, I think, when we're looking at early comics, there was not much given to characterization. Mm. If you look at even up in, comics 30 some years old by this time, look at the Silver Age of DC Comics in the 60s, those heroes were very cardboard cutout, two-dimensional heroes that had no problems, and everything just went their way. Then Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and several others came out with the Marvel heroes during the Silver Age, and those heroes had issues. They fought amongst themselves. Not everything went well for them. Peter Parker struggled to pay rent. He had this overwhelming guilt of blaming himself for causing his uncle's death. So, and you see this whole flux to comics and older readers to comics because of this characterization. And continuing on, the 70s were a bit stagnant, but you get into the 80s, which I consider to be the best era of comics, at least superhero comics.
Right.
You get into the 80s, and I think the 80s there was this great balance between plot, action, big ideas, and characterization. And there's so many wonderful runs during the 80s. A lot of those writers and artists during the 80s grew up on the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby stuff, and they just developed it for their times, and there was a little more characterization, and perhaps they were trying to make it a little more what they thought realistic. And of course, Frank Miller was probably the biggest star of that during that time with Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. So characterization, important, really interesting in comics during the 80s. And in the 90s, we start to see a lot of independent comics. Of course, we had those in the 80s as well with great characterization, but talking about the big two. At DC, you have Vertigo, where it's not all superhero stuff, but you have just tremendous characterization with things like Sandman, John Constantine's Hellblazer, got Shade the Changing Man, Animal Man was incredible. I could list in just probably 50 great comics that came out of the Vertigo imprint with wonderful characterization.
Fables is another good
Fables
one.
is a great one. But then we get to the 2000s, and we get a lot of creators into the comic business who didn't grow up on Jack Kirby, Stan Lee stuff. They didn't grow up knowing comics from that era, and they started to be people who were influenced by movies that could do what comics could, finally, because of CGI. They were folks who grew up perhaps influenced by video games and other mediums, and not so much comics. Of course, I'm speculating here, but a lot of the folks that we see in the 2000s, and even when you read interviews with them, they didn't grow up on comics. And what they do now, there's a couple reasons for this. They write these stories where they are going to write the character the way they want to, regardless of the history of the character. And I realize things change with times, but sometimes these characterizations and these story arcs that they take them upon have nothing to do with superhero comics. So there's a bit of that going on, but also they're writing these comics for the trade paperbacks, so they can they extend stories way out. So we're in the 80s and even in the early 90s, where a story might be 2 monthly issues long, we're looking at 6 to 8, sometimes 10. So you get this phenomenon that often is referred to as talking heads, a bunch of panels where you have these characters just talking to each other. And that kind of characterization does not interest me. I don't find it very enjoyable as a reader, at least not in this medium of comics. It could be different in fiction or different in television or movies, but in comics, I don't like it. And comics are so expensive now, where I would have paid almost nothing for a complete story in the 80s or 90s. It is costing me more than going out and buying a new video game, to get a whole story of characters just talking to each other.
Right. No, I get you. And we'll definitely touch base on that next week, because we're going to talk about the 80s and 90s next week. Little spoiler alert for listeners that we will be going back in time to the 80s next week and maybe the 90s. And we'll talk about what happened in the industry then and, some of the various titles and such. But just in terms of characterization for comic books, they change. That's one of the beauties of comics, I think, too. They change with the times, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's face it. Batman came out in, 1939, I believe?
Something like that, 39-40.
Yeah, so as a kid, do you think when I'm 12 in the 80s, I'm going to relate to 40s Batman who's, fighting bootleggers? No, I'm not going to find that interesting at all. Now, I will buy into a Batman that's fighting crime in the gritty streets of Gotham, and and he's like, oh, I'm capturing this rapist or something, like, oh wow, yeah, he's a bad guy, let's get him, but back then it was like, oh, he's peddling booze, okay, well, whatever. You know, like
But as a 12-year-old, you're not going to want to read a comic where there's no fighting in the issue whatsoever, and it's Batman having a pseudo intellectual conversation with Alfred for
Right.
25 pages, and Alfred's talking about the working conditions that he grew up in England and classist society. No 12-year-old gives a crap
for
about
sure.
that.
Matter of fact, I've not yet watched an episode, so forgive me if it's actually good. But based on the premise and title alone, I refuse to watch it. HBO. We'll get to this in the video beat too as well. HBO released a series called Pennyworth.
Oh,
If
yes,
there's
that's right.
one thing we do not need, it's to know the background of a butler to Batman. You know what I mean? It's like, I really don't care. He's Alfred. He's great. He's,
Yep.
he helps him out. But do we need the whole exposition of, Alfred's past to know Batman? No, not at all. It's like, just show me Batman, So,
For sure.
so moving on to our reviews, we had challenged each other.
Sure.
And you had challenged me to read the Judas Contract.
Yep.
Teen Titans. I think 80, was it 87?
Nope.
No.
83, 84.
83, 84. Okay. Let me say, so I got the trade paperback and read it. And my mind was blown away. I mean, how can you go wrong? Wolfman and Perez, but I mean, really what made it part so fantastic was the edginess.
Right.
Even for that time, it had edginess. Talking about like the old 40s, 50s, 60s comics, like they had a society as a whole had a notion, and it's still this way somewhat, but not as bad, that comic books are for kids. Right.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of born that that stigma, if you will, and they had simplistic writing, because they're for kids, but that really became a paradox in this book.
For sure.
Because you have the main characters, who are the Teen Titans. They're too young to be in the Justice League that has the headliners of the day, Flash, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, etc. So they're too young for the Justice League, but they have to deal with issues of, saving the world and having these abilities and such, on top of being normal, angsty teenage kids, So it was a little edgy. It was violent, it was sexual, and it was more sophisticated than the titles of the headliners at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really what caught my eye as I was reading it, and I really think it kind of went a long ways to making DC a rival to Marvel and some of the inks that we saw in Peter Parker and how am I going to pay rent and that sort of thing. But we see that in Teen Titans as well. I mean, Marv Wolfman, great writing, all in all. We're shown like a really fragile union between the teenagers with all the ego and angst that I mentioned, and they have to still show a good image to the world. Like they still have we're heroes, and to spoiler alert, there is why it's called the Judas Contract. There's the Judas amongst the ranks, and Trader infiltrates the ranks and basically destroy them from within. And it couple that writing with the artwork by Perez, it's amazing. One of the first things that caught my eye, and I'm sure we'll talk about this because I challenge you with a book by Jack the King Kirby. And we'll mention this as well. There's one thing that I just keep coming back to as a comics lover, and that's Kirby dots. Are you familiar with the Kirby dots and lines?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I would hope so. And for our listeners who are not, would you like to explain those?
You can go ahead and do it.
Okay. So Kirby dots, it was a very, I don't know, it'd be looked at as simplistic, I guess, in some aspects.
Yep.
But he had a way of doing this that is mind-blowing. And I
have
loved
some
that George Perez mimicked this in the Teen Titans. What it was he would use dots and shading and like different colors, shading and such, to signify energy or superpower or force, if you will. He did force lines as well. And it's become a landmark use in comic books. Yeah, you're showing me some now, and I'm like, yep. I love that. I don't know why. There's two things I love and use in artistry in comic books: Kirby dots and lines. And back in the 2099 Punisher 2099 imprint title, they they did ink splatter for blood, and they
Oh,
just
yeah.
splatter the page, and I'm just like, that is awesome. So that, like, artistically, if you want to get me, use Kirby dots and lines or ink splatter, and I'm there. I'm hooked. And in particular, the 2099 titles, which I'm kind of reading through now, they use a lot of that.
Oh, for sure.
And I just love Kirby's artwork. I mean, he was Jack the King Kirby for a reason, right? But you could see that George Perez was definitely influenced by his coworker in that, because he used some of the same techniques that Kirby used. And I'm like, man, that's great. So, and speaking of Jack the King Kirby,
I said, nope.
I challenge you with Commandy.
Yeah. Before I jump into this, just a couple things about the Teen Titans Judas contract. A few minutes ago, we were talking about characterization in comics and the difference between people who grew up reading Kirby and Stan Lee and folks of that era. Well, George Perez, and Marv Wolfman both grew up on that stuff, and that's why you see George's artwork. There are influences by Kirby, and you see Marv Wolfman with these characters with angst. And what I really, really liked about the Judas contract, there's a couple things I would point out. I was 13 reading that storyline. I was probably about 12, maybe 11. Yeah, probably about 11 when the title came out. And one of the things that Marv Wolfman and George Perez were doing was having the Titans grow up. So the Titans, for the most part, were late teens, early 20s as they go through the story. And they wrote them that way. You were talking about the sexual aspect of it, where they were starting to have relationships that were more adult and grown up. And that was reflected in the stories. And for me, as a kid who was going through puberty and starting to wonder about that aspect of my life coming up, it was portrayed really well amongst this whole genre of superheroes. I really, really liked that. And one of the things I would also point out to you is, so this storyline took place in the New Teen Titans, issue 42, 43, 44, and an annual. I think it was annual number 2. So can you imagine having Tara, the traitor, the Judas, introduced well before this? Well before,
Right.
and you end up loving the character, and she's one of your favorite characters, and then she is the Judas. So it wasn't like she was just introduced for this storyline.
Right.
It
I had wondered that when I
oh.
read it, because I knew it picked up, like the
Yes.
trade paperback picks up,
It
partway
blew our
through the run
minds.
or whatever. And I'm like, oh.
Yeah, it
well,
was almost 4 years into the title.
Yeah, so I'm like, it's,
It absolutely blew our minds, my friends and I, who were
Yeah.
reading it concurrently with the publication, and we couldn't believe it. It was our story. But getting to Commandy, so I only read one issue because I don't have that many issues of Commandy. I haven't really read it before because I was waiting to get the entire run of Kirby's Commandy. This came out during his Fourth World stuff at DC. For those who don't know that's like the New Gods. It also includes Jimmy Olsen and several other titles that kind of tied together, where it's almost as if Kirby was giving his own imprint, if you will, in the DC universe. And so I didn't have that many issues of Commandy, even though I read all the other stuff, and I just hadn't got around to reading it. And so I read issue number 4, as it's the oldest one that I have. And I will say the art is stellar. I mean, it's great. It's Jack Kirby. It's he wrote it and drew it. This is March of '73. So back then, comics would have been on the shelf 4 months before what the date actually said. So this would have been probably December of 1972, when I was still 1.5 years old. So, of course, I never really saw it out on the shelves. But as I mentioned, the artwork is great. It's written and drawn by Jack Kirby, and it's lettered and inked by Mike Royer, who did a lot of Kirby's work in his later years. By this time, I'm guessing Kirby was probably, if this was 70s, he was certainly I would say in his 50s.
Yeah.
So this was after his Hallmark years at Marvel. And I'm not a huge fan of Royer's inking. I don't dislike it, but my favorite Kirby inker is Joe Sinnott. But it's good. It's good. The art is great. Kirby was drawing and producing a lot of comics at this time. So just imagine that he is producing so many comics and still giving us panels with backgrounds and interesting composition and full of characters and detail. I mean, that's just a testament to his craftsmanship, his work ethic, and his imagination. In terms of the story itself, to be honest, Kirby was great for concepts. He's great with art. And yes, he has some great stories that were just purely his own. But in my opinion, if he's writing the story himself, it isn't always they're hit or miss. I'll just say that. And this particular story, it's not horrible, but it is definitely a complete ripoff of Planet of the Apes.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I reading the first issue.
Yeah.
Because I have the collected work digitally, even.
Absolutely.
And I'm like, oh, yeah, this is totally Planet of the Apes, but it's fun. Like, it adds more to it than the Planet. Like, and I don't get me wrong.
Sure it does.
I love the whole Planet of the Apes franchise. I mean, even the newer ones I like, but the old 60s ones I loved. Sure. And when I was reading it, I thought the same exact thing. Like, wow, this is totally Planet of the Apes. This is amazing.
Yep. Yeah, it was very much Planet of the Apes-y. Because I'm coming in a fourth issue, I don't know Commandy's origin or his friends' origins, but his friends all seem to be wearing astronaut type of costumes. And they're running into more than just apes, though. It's other animals that now have speech. The animals, once they encounter these humans, are shocked that these humans can speak, and they refer to the humans as animals. Very much Planet of the Apes.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Commandy says, hey, you would be surprised. At one point, humans were in control of the world, and you were in zoos. Very much Planet of the Apes. Yep. So, even at the time, Planet of the Apes was huge.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And even if you came in with issue number 1, you would still not know that much about Commandy's background.
No, okay.
Issue number 1 just starts it running. Like,
yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
Boom, here it is. This is the world that it is, the way it is now. So, and I think issue number 1 had that great cover with him rowboating or like paddle boating.
Killer cover
with the ruins of New York in the background.
That's a killer.
It's
cover.
Amazing. It is very good. I mean, and that's one thing we could say. The whole series has really good covers on their issues. But I digress. So I came up with a little bit of a rating system. I totally ripped it off of Batman 1966.
Okay.
The movie from the oceanic bat sprays, if you will. Just a simple rating system. So for Teen Titans, for me, the Judas Contract, I rate as a manta ray repellent on the Batman oceanic spray chart. So knowing what you said about Commandy, how would you rate it for the bat spray chart?
I don't know what my options are in the bat spray chart.
Okay. Well, that being the case, I will show you. So Lois being the... Is it an octopus? Let me double check.
How many different choices are there?
There's only 4.
Okay, only 4?
So it makes it simple.
Okay.
So even just rolling in on a simple 1 to 4 scale, and then I'll let you know what the appropriate spray is here, so to speak. So, okay, you have Barracuda, Whale, Manta Ray, and Shark. I mean, because let's face it, sharks are awesome. So,
what was the second one?
So the second one was Whale.
I might give it a Whale.
Yeah,
it'd probably be higher because of Kirby's art. I tend to want to make it higher, and I love how he DC's usually in fictional cities, and this is in a Las Vegas suburb he doesn't mention, but then you look up on the shopping square sign, it says Henderson. All these little details are terrific. But I did think the story was, and I know comic stories are derivative and genre stories are derivative. I just thought it was so derivative of a concurrent franchise, Planet of the Apes, which was out at that time, not just with movies, but with television shows, toys, comics themselves. I thought it was just so derivative that it kind of pulled the enjoyment down for me. So, yeah, I would probably only give it the Whale or the number 2 stars out of 4 stars.
Yep, Whale.
If I were
Whale repellent.
If I were to put it on a 5-star system, I would still only give it 2.
Okay.
I want to give it higher because the art's gorgeous, the cover's gorgeous. So if I could separate the two, I don't think that this is the best Kirby art I've ever seen, but I'd give it a 4 out of 5. It's a magnificent. But in terms of the writing, I would definitely give it a 2. It doesn't blow my mind or anything. But I really like it, and so are we going to challenge each other again for the next episode with something?
I think so. I do have your next title for you.
Oh shoot, I haven't even thought for yours yet. So tell me what my next challenge is.
Well, you play guitar, and you are an awesome guitarist.
Well, thank you, sir.
You do some metal riffing, and it's just it's awesome. So, the most metal title out there, I think.
What? Okay, this
from
sounds
2019, Murder Falcon. Have you heard of this?
I've never heard of this.
Oh man, this is great.
So it's a new comic.
It's a newer
years old.
comic.
Okay.
And I don't generally like newer comics, but this is cool.
Murder
and,
Falcon.
And the artwork, there's something to be desired there. But the concept is so awesome. It's about this guy who's a guitarist. You know, he's kind of like, I don't know, typical burnout, long hair, hippie freak. That's just like, you know, like making his way through life type thing, like living out of his van sort of thing. And he finds that when he plays guitar, he summons this like space falcon creature with a huge bionic arm who fights these huge monsters, like kaiju type monsters on Earth.
Nice.
Like, so they're a hero team. And it's like, oh man, there's this huge kaiju monster attacking a city. And then he's like, I'm here. And he like plays a chord, and all of a sudden he's like, hey Jake, nice to see you. Let's do this. And Murder Falcon gets his powers from him playing guitar. So it's really an odd concept, but it's so metal.
What publisher?
Let me double check that, because I can't think off the top of my head.
Murder Falcon.
Yeah, it's been like I said, it's been so good.
I have thousands of ideas. I'm trying to think about which one I think would be best. Let me look up the issue numbers so I make sure I get this correct. But I'm going to give you another 80s comic that many people do not like. I like it because I was there for the change. I enjoyed it. Was it the best comic on the market? No, and I even knew that then. And this approach did not last as long as it could have. But I'll just spit it out here. So I'm going to give you the Justice League of America, the issues, and I'll look them up in a second here. The issues where they totally revamped it. It was the new Justice League. And I'm not talking about the new Justice League where it was just Justice League and funny by DeMatteis, or however you pronounce his name, and Keith Giffen. No, I'm talking about before that. So this is probably 1984 as well. I'm going to give you a taste of another team. This is when the Justice League disbanded, the big heroes that you think of, the icons, and Aquaman.
Forget about it.
Basically pulled together a new team of nobodies. And this was DC's approach to the X-Men. They were trying to get characters with different nationalities, brand new, young, just a whole different approach. So like the all new X-Men did so well for 4 or 5 years, DC's thinking, okay, what can we do similar to that? Because Justice League is not selling that well. And it's the Detroit era Justice League.
Oh, okay, yeah, I know what you're talking about then.
And
Yes,
I'm
my
looking
friend
up the
James
issues
loves
right now.
that era.
Yeah, I loved it too, because it's just something I'm totally interested in, and I was there, and I enjoyed it. But I will tell you that when you go back, or when I go back and I go to read it, yeah, it's nowhere near as good as the Teen Titans, but it's going to be quite different. I won't give you much more than that outside of this broadcast.
Okay.
I'll give you the exact issues that I'm thinking. I want to guess that it's like it starts with an annual, and I just happened to pick up that annual at a grocery store when I was first getting into comics, and I really loved it, so I thought I'll go grab the normal title. And I want to say it probably was issues 225 through 250 at most. You don't have to read all of them.
Right.
You read a handful. You got to at least read the annual to see how it all comes together. But basically, the Justice League, again, is going to a real city. It's not one of their made up ones, in Detroit of all places, and they're led by Aquaman, who at the time was not a top tier character.
No, not at all.
So that's my challenge to you.
I will definitely check it out. Murder Falcon is by Image Comics, by the way.
Oh, of course. Okay.
So yeah, and it's Daniel Warren Johnson and Mike Spicer.
Who was the first creator?
Daniel Warren Johnson.
Okay.
So it's cool. Nothing else. Like, it was recommended to me by one of my friends who actually writes reviews for different sites and such, and he said it's a phenomenal title, and I gotta agree. Just the concept alone is cool.
Awesome. I'll have to check that out.
For sure. So moving on to our video beat segment, really briefly. So I'll just update everyone. We are not stuck in Supernatural world anymore.
Oh yeah, you guys decided to.
My wife discovered books. No, I'm not. I'm not saying that to be rude or anything to her or tease her. But she's been reading a lot lately, and so we found with her reading, I'm reading too, and that's when I read the Comic Challenge or other titles, and we've not turned the TV on nearly as much, which can be a good thing, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
We did catch up on House of Dragon, which is still good.
For sure.
And we started a new mini series, and my wife likes to binge watch lots of episodes, and that's why I thought we'd stick with Supernatural, but having her seen it before, and she kind of lost interest and such, but that's okay. We started a new one called Gunpowder. It's on HBO Max, and it has Kit Harington from Game of Thrones in it.
It's a cool title.
And yeah, and I was like, oh, and it's the premise is about something I like. It's the storyline is the gunpowder plot of 1605.
Ooh.
November 5th. Remember the 5th of November.
That's absolutely right.
And it's a dramatization of all the events leading up to that.
Ooh.
And yeah, and it's just there are 3 issues. I'm stuck in the comic form, I guess. No, it's 3 episodes. And so far we just watched the first 2, and they're a little over an hour each. Hopefully we'll finish up and wrap up with the third one tonight, but I take that back. We're going to see a play tonight. So this weekend sometime. So it's been very, very good, actually. The filming, the acting, costumes, sets, everything have been spot on. So if you get a chance, check out Gunpowder. It's pretty good. That's really what we've been watching lately. Other than that, it is spooky season. So we did watch Halloween Ends last week, and that was good. It's funny because a lot of people have been giving it flag, like, oh, Halloween 3 was way better than Halloween Ends. I'm like, I thought it was good. I mean, was it the ending that we deserved for such a franchise that has been ingrained in our culture and, big part of our history, so to speak, as far as horror goes? Not necessarily. I don't think it did. The final movie there did not do it justice for the entire franchise.
I've never seen a single Halloween movie.
Oh my goodness, Ron, that's your challenge. The first one alone is amazing. I don't know if you like slasher film genre.
I used to. I watched everything I could. I just never got to the Halloween ones. I watched dozens upon dozens in the 80s and 90s.
See, and the thing, in the 90s is when I really started watching the slasher movies and stuff, because when I was in the 80s, my parents would never let me watch those, But my friends in the 90s in high school, they were like, oh, Halloween's the best. Because Mike Myers, everybody else, Freddy Krueger, and Jason, they wait till night to kill. Like, Mike Myers comes out during the day even.
Interesting.
And I'm like, oh. And back then, it was like, mind-blowing. What? A slasher that comes out during the day? And so I watched the first one. The cinematography on the first one alone is amazing. The opening shot is one single cut. And for a while, it held the record for the longest cut of an opening for a movie.
Gosh, I gotta watch this. It just never the killer never interested me in any of the trailers or highlights. So I'm like, I'll get around to it someday. And I've watched dozens upon dozens of horror movies.
Yeah, and he's brutal, but he's just like, it's good. It's really good. The first one is really good, and matter of fact, I would challenge you to watch both first and second one back to back if you can. If time is an issue, no problem. But the second one actually picks up minutes after the first one ends.
Nice.
And it's just like I could watch both of them back to back. It's like watching one long movie.
And that's Jamie Lee Curtis.
Yeah, Jamie Lee Curtis, and John Carpenter. He also wrote the theme.
Nice.
Which is iconic now, But the Halloween movies in general are amazing. I try to watch them every year, at least a
Okay.
few every year.
Gonna have to check that out.
There are weaker entries into the franchise, but and skip 3 altogether. It's in its own right. It's a good movie. I mean, it's good, cheesy horror Halloween type movie. But what they had planned on doing is having Halloween's Part 1 and 2 be standalone stories, and then with 3 they're going to switch it and start being an anthology series, with each movie being its own entry into this trope of Halloween, if you will, like the trick or treat movies and stuff. Honestly, everybody did not like that. Like the audience rebelled and was like, "What is this? Where's Michael Myers? Like, where's our bad guy?
Is
So,
Halloween 3 late 80s?
yeah.
See, I think that's when I attempted to watch. It probably was the first one I tried, and I thought, this is boring. I don't
Oh,
like
it was. It was pretty boring. It was pretty lame. But the first 2 are amazing. 3 I skip. 4 isn't too bad because it's a return of Michael Myers. And then you have like the Curse of Michael Myers and like on from there. And those are all, like 5 and 6 are a little weaker. They're not bad. And then it gets really near the 90s is where it's like, oh, okay, this is a little much, But then the last few movies, Halloween Kills, and Halloween Ends, the last 3, absolutely amazing.
That's cool.
So
I'll have to check
those tie right in. So
if I can,
good.
I will. My challenge is I have small children,
oh yeah, yep.
and they control the TV more than I. But if I can, I will watch Halloween. Just as a side note, I might get the title of this wrong. The documentary series on Netflix. Have you seen the Friday the 13th episode of the movies we grew up on?
The movies that made us.
Yeah, the movies that made us. Yeah, that's
yes,
it.
I have not yet.
Oh my gosh, it's so good.
I was gonna say I've seen a few of those episodes of the show, the movies that made us, and it is amazing.
Yes, I love it.
So, and I love Friday the 13th.
Yeah, me too.
There's actually we signed up for Shudder last year around this time because there's so much great programming if you're a horror fan on Shudder. One of the reasons I signed up for it was a documentary, In Search of Darkness. And now they have like 2 more movies coming out. Well, there's parts 1 and 2. Now they have a third one coming out about sci-fi movies that they're doing on Kickstarter right now. So they're raising funding. So a little plug for that. But the In Search of Darkness, I can't remember if I saw 2. But the first one is a documentary. And it's like 4.5 hours long. So it's a beast. But they go through almost every horror movie from the 70s and 80s.
Nice.
And they talk about it. And they have experts. They cut away interviews to, experts or stars of the movies or like, I don't know. It's just really cool to see Bruce Campbell, Ash from Army of Darkness or whatnot, talking about, Friday the 13th. It's just things like that. It was like, oh, wow, that's really cool. And
That's awesome.
it's very, very well done. So if you get a chance to see that too, if, In Search of Darkness is really good. And they intersperse clips of the movies, of course. But it's mind-blowing. Like, I put it on to clean the house one day. I just was like, had it on in the background, just listening to it. And I kept finding I was distracted by it. Because I was like, okay, this is way too cool. I'm just going to have to watch it at some point. But yeah, Halloween 1 and 2, I'd challenge you to watch if you can.
For sure. If I get a chance, I will definitely watch them. Now, if I get a chance before next time, I will do that. My watching has been a little more limited because of having small kids.
Mm-hmm.
I did finish the entire Rings of Power series on Amazon. If I were to give it a 1 out of 5 stars, a 5-star system, I would give it a 1.5 or 2. Simply just because, and none of the stuff that's controversial that has people bickering online, it just was not well written.
No?
It meandered and meandered. Some things were never dealt with, and sometimes there were like contradictions. I'm paraphrasing here, and I don't remember if it was in the same episode, but it might have been in the same episode where Galadriel's pleading her case. In one moment, I'm paraphrasing. This is not the actual dialogue, but there's orcs everywhere and all these different lands, blah blah blah. And then next she's speaking to, I think it might have been the Elven King, but no one has seen an orc in 12 years, and it's like it's contradictory even in itself, and I don't know. It just I thought her acting was not the greatest. I think the acting in general in the show is not the greatest. The elves were not very regal. The Elrond in the Jackson films, magnificent, royal, seems, like a true leader. the actor who portrays him in Rings of Power seems like everything the opposite of that. And I could list so many different things. I stuck with the series. I wanted to see what it was about. It's not very Tolkien-esque, and it's my understanding by looking at the ratings, the minutes watched. Yeah, for the longest time it was Amazon's #1 show, but as it got so the way these ratings are done, they look at the minutes of viewership, right?
Right.
Well, even though I got more and more episodes, other shows that came along in Amazon itself surpassed it.
Yeah, right.
With less episodes. So, comparing House of Dragon, I'm not done with it yet, but House of Dragon is just stellar compared to this. Perhaps the greatest thing ever written if you compare the two.
Right.
So much better. So I think, Rings of Power was the thing that I put my television energy into lately, and it was very, very disappointing. I would say this. I'm still going to go back and check out the second season, but if I get 2 or 3 episodes in and it's still meandering and not getting anywhere, I'm not going to watch it. I've read, I don't know if this is true, that the 2 showrunners are getting the axe. And maybe not the axe completely. They might still stay in the writers team, but they're not going to be the showrunners. So maybe next year it'll be less wishy-washy.
Well, here's hoping that it's more like Star Trek, and it suffers from Star Trek syndrome, is what I say. Almost, especially through the 80s and 90s. I mean, I like Star Trek shows, that's no secret.
For sure, yeah.
Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, like that era of Star Trek was amazing, I think. But if you go back and look at season 1 of Next Generation, it was not good. Same with Deep Space Nine. As much as I love Deep Space Nine, season 1 was like the weakest season. So, and it's still good, don't get me wrong, but I'm hoping that Rings of Power is like that, where season 1 is like, meh, and then the rest of it surpasses it. And I kind of have the same hopes for the Wheels of Time series. We started watching that, we completed season 1 of that, and we thought it was good.
Yeah, I liked it. I thought it was okay. I didn't think it was great, but I liked it.
Right. It was good. It wasn't okay. I'd give it a solid C+. Great effort.
I'll say this: if you haven't watched Rings of Power yet, Wheel of Time's way better.
Okay. Shadow and Bone was another one that we watched season 1 of, and we're waiting for season 2 because it was pretty good.
I don't know that one.
So that one, I believe it's on Netflix. But that one was really good. Just the premise of fantasy mixed with Victorian and steampunk stuff. Sure, why not? So we liked it. But
I would just to get to something you said a second ago, the Star Trek syndrome. I could see that with a lot of shows in their first seasons. The pushback I would give to you on the Next Generation is this: I would say yes, they hadn't found their thematic flavor yet for the crew and how everybody interacted with each other, the actors' portrayals of their characters, they hadn't quite settled into where their characters were going to be. But I still think the concepts in some of the episodes themselves were still well written, because you had your writers like D.C. Fontana and people like that who are, who wrote on the original show and who had written many other things and were fantastic. So hopefully Rings of Power can rebound, but I think it's going to take a great overhaul to do that.
I think so. So
I got to challenge you with a movie.
Okay, yeah, challenge me.
Have you watched the Northman yet?
No.
With Bill Skarsgård's brother?
No, I have not.
You should watch that.
Okay.
I believe it's on. Do you have Prime? Amazon Prime?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. We have almost every streaming service imaginable.
I think it's free on Prime right now.
Okay.
And so it's terrific. It's heady. It breaks a lot of tropes. So I think you'll enjoy it.
Okay. We'll check it out. The Northman. Sounds good. So I think that just about wraps things up, huh?
Well, have we talked about everything? We talked about games. We talked about comics, TV, and movies a little bit. So yeah, it's another fun week. A lot more fun stuff to talk about, and we've got some challenges. So I gave you the Justice League challenge. What was the comic challenge you gave me again?
Murder Falcon.
Murder Falcon. That's right. How did I forget that?
Murder Falcon.
Okay.
So much fun.
Well, we ran a little bit long when you know it. It's just like Barry Allen and Kid Flash in the prehistoric era. We are out of time. I'm Ron Rader.
And I'm Mark Allen. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
And until next time,
Play on, nerds.